What's the most disturbing way a relative has tried to control a decision that wasn't theirs to make? I was standing in the ICU at County Memorial Hospital when Dr. Naveen Kapoor pulled me into the hallway and told me my wife Melissa had zero brain activity after 3 days on the ventilator following her car accident. The scans showed massive irreversible damage from the impact when a drunk driver ran a red light and T-boned her sedan at 60 miles per hour. Dr. Kapoor explained gently that Melissa was legally brain dead and the machines were the only thing keeping her body functioning, that she would never wake up or breathe on her own again. He said I needed to consider withdrawing life support because continuing treatment was medically futile and prolonging what was essentially death. My hands were shaking when he handed me the paperwork, explaining my options as Melissa's legal next of kin and medical power of attorney holder. I'd been married to Melissa for 11 years, and we had a 9-year-old daughter named Sophie, who kept asking when Mommy would wake up. I stood there in that hallway with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of disinfectant making me nauseous, while I tried to process that I had to decide whether to let my wife's body die to match her already dead brain. Before I could even begin to think clearly about the decision, Melissa's mother, Francine, appeared at the end of the hallway with her sister Lorraine and Melissa's brother Gerald. Francine's face was red and swollen from crying, but her eyes were hard when she walked up to me and said, "You're not making any decisions about my daughter without my permission." I explained that Dr. Kapoor had just told me Melissa was brain dead and that as her husband and medical proxy, I needed to consider what she would have wanted. Francine grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and told me she didn't care what any doctor said, that Melissa was alive as long as her heart was beating and I had no right to kill her. Dr. Kapoor tried to intervene and explain the medical reality, but Francine started screaming that doctors were wrong all the time, and there were cases of people waking up from comas after months or years. Gerald stepped between us and told me firmly that if I tried to remove life support, he'd make sure I regretted it, that the family would never forgive me and they'd do whatever necessary to stop me. Lorraine was filming everything on her phone, and when I told her to stop, she said she was documenting me trying to murder Melissa and they'd use it as evidence. Hospital security had to escort them out, while Francine shouted that she was calling her lawyer and I wouldn't get away with this. I sat in the waiting area afterward, shaking, and Dr. Kapoor sat beside me and asked if I had legal representation, because he'd seen situations where families contested medical decisions and it could get complicated. He said the hospital had resources including patient advocacy and legal consultation if I needed help navigating what was likely going to become a difficult situation. I told him Melissa and I had discussed end-of-life wishes after her father died 2 years ago, and she'd been very clear that she never wanted to be kept alive on machines with no quality of life. She'd made me promise I wouldn't let her exist as just a body if her mind was gone. Dr. Kapoor documented that conversation in his notes and said it would be important if Francine tried to legally challenge my authority to make medical decisions. I went home that night to tell Sophie that Mommy's brain had stopped working and wasn't going to start again, that we needed to let her body rest too. Sophie cried in my arms and asked if it would hurt Mommy, and I promised it wouldn't, because Mommy wasn't really there anymore, just her body that the machines were keeping going. We sat together on the couch looking at photo albums, and I let Sophie pick out pictures to keep by her bed. The next morning, Francine showed up at our house at 7 with a man in a suit who introduced himself as Attorney Malcolm Vega, specializing in medical malpractice and patient rights. Malcolm handed me a temporary restraining order, preventing me from authorizing any changes to Melissa's treatment pending a hearing to determine medical decision-making authority. Francine had filed an emergency petition claiming I was trying to prematurely end life support against the family's wishes, and that there was disagreement about Melissa's prognosis. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later, and Malcolm suggested I get my own attorney because this was going to be contested. I called my friend Richard, who worked at a law firm, and he connected me with Natasha Cordero, who specialized in medical law and family disputes. Natasha came to my house that afternoon, and took detailed notes about my conversation with Melissa regarding end-of-life wishes and about what Dr. Kapoor had told me regarding brain death. She explained that as Melissa's husband and designated medical proxy, I had legal authority to make decisions, but Francine's petition would force a judge to review the situation and potentially appoint a guardian ad litem to represent Melissa's interests independently. Natasha filed a response to Francine's petition, including Dr. Kapoor's medical reports documenting Melissa's brain death and my sworn statement about Melissa's expressed wishes. She also requested expedited resolution because every day Melissa remained on life support was emotionally traumatic for our daughter and medically futile. The hearing happened on a Friday morning in Judge Celeste Briggs's courtroom with Francine on one side, represented by Malcolm, and me on the other with Natasha. Dr. Kapoor testified about the medical evidence showing complete cessation of brain activity with no possibility of recovery and explained that continued life support was not treatment, but rather prolonging the dying process. Malcolm tried to argue that brain death determinations were not always accurate and presented articles about rare cases of misdiagnosis, but Dr. Kapoor explained that Melissa had undergone multiple tests over 3 days, all confirming the same conclusion. Francine took the stand crying and saying she couldn't accept that her daughter was gone, that Melissa had always been a fighter and might still wake up if given more time. She claimed I was rushing to end treatment because I wanted to move on with my life and didn't really love Melissa. Malcolm asked if I had life insurance on Melissa and implied I had financial motivation to let her die, which was such a disgusting accusation that Natasha objected immediately, and the judge sustained it. I testified about the conversation Melissa and I had after her father's death, where she'd explicitly said she never wanted to be kept alive artificially if there was no hope of recovery with meaningful quality of life. I described how she'd made me promise not to let her family's emotions override her wishes because she knew her mother would have trouble letting go. Natasha presented the medical power of attorney documents Melissa had signed, designating me as her healthcare decision-maker precisely for situations like this. Judge Briggs asked Francine directly if she had any evidence that Melissa had changed her mind about her end-of-life wishes or any medical evidence contradicting the brain death diagnosis. Francine couldn't provide either, and the judge ruled that I maintained full authority as medical proxy and could proceed with whatever decisions I deemed appropriate in consultation with Melissa's medical team. The judge did appoint Dr. Lisa Feng as an independent medical examiner to review Melissa's case and confirm the brain death diagnosis, with a report due within 48 hours. Francine started screaming when the judge gavelled the hearing closed, saying she'd appeal and I'd never get away with murdering her daughter. Gerald had to physically restrain her from coming at me across the courtroom. Natasha walked me out through a side exit to avoid more confrontation and explained that Dr. Feng's examination was a formality, but necessary to ensure the court had complete medical documentation before I made any final decisions. Dr. Feng examined Melissa that afternoon and reviewed all the tests and scans before submitting her report, confirming complete and irreversible brain death with zero possibility of recovery. She noted in her report that continued life support served no medical purpose and was causing unnecessary emotional trauma to family members, particularly Melissa's young daughter. Judge Briggs reviewed the report and issued an order affirming my authority to make medical decisions without further court intervention. I met with Dr. Kapoor and the palliative care team to discuss the process of withdrawing life support and what to expect. They explained they would gradually reduce the ventilator support and other interventions while providing comfort measures, that Melissa's body would likely cease functioning within minutes to hours once the machines were turned off. I decided to do it on Sunday morning so I could prepare Sophie and give Melissa's body a chance to rest. I called Francine to tell her the decision and give her the opportunity to say goodbye beforehand. She hung up on me, and 10 minutes later my phone started getting dozens of calls and texts from extended family members calling me a murderer and saying I was killing Melissa for insurance money, or to be with another woman. I blocked most of the numbers, but the harassment continued through social media and emails. Someone posted my home address online along with accusations that I was ending my wife's life prematurely, and dozens of strangers sent death threats and hateful messages. I had to take Sophie to my parents' house for the weekend because protesters showed up outside our home holding signs saying, "Don't kill Melissa," and shouting at me when I tried to leave for the hospital. Police came and dispersed them, but told me I should consider staying elsewhere until things calmed down. Saturday evening, I went to the hospital to spend time with Melissa's body before the life support withdrawal. The ICU nurse told me Francine had been there earlier with a man claiming to be Melissa's physician requesting access to her medical records and treatment information. The hospital had refused without proper documentation, and Francine had caused a scene before security escorted her out. I sat beside Melissa's bed, holding her hand even though I knew she couldn't feel it, talking to her about Sophie and how much we loved her and how sorry I was that I had to let her go. A different nurse came in around 9 and apologized for interrupting, but said hospital administration had received a complaint that I was refusing to provide adequate care for my wife, and they needed to document that wasn't true. I asked who filed the complaint, and she said it came through the state medical board as an anonymous tip. I called Natasha immediately, and she said this was likely Francine trying to create a record of alleged neglect to use in future legal action. She contacted hospital administration directly to explain the situation and provide copies of the court orders confirming my authority and the medical evidence supporting withdrawal of life support. The hospital attorney assured her they understood the situation and the complaint would be noted as baseless harassment. Sunday morning, I brought Sophie to the hospital with my parents for support. The palliative care team had prepared a private room away from the ICU where we could be with Melissa during the process. Sophie held her mother's hand and told her she loved her and that it was okay to stop fighting. My parents stood on the other side of the bed crying quietly while Dr. Kapoor explained each step of what they were doing. They reduced the ventilator settings gradually, and Melissa's body responded exactly as predicted, her heart rate dropping and her breathing becoming irregular before stopping completely. She was pronounced dead at 10:23 a.m. on Sunday, March 15th, and I felt like my own heart had stopped too, even though I knew this was what needed to happen. The funeral home came to collect Melissa's body, and I started making arrangements for a memorial service later that week. Francine called screaming that I'd murdered her daughter and she'd make sure everyone knew what I'd done. She said she was going to the police to file charges, and she'd take Sophie away from me because I was clearly unstable and dangerous. I told her to stop calling and hung up. That afternoon, 2 police officers came to my parents' house asking to speak with me about a report that I'd coerced my wife into signing medical documents against her will and then used those documents to end her life prematurely. The officers seemed skeptical of the allegations, but said they had to investigate any complaint and asked for my side of the story. I showed them the court orders and medical reports and explained the entire situation, including Francine's harassment campaign. They took notes and said they'd file a report, but it was clear this was a family dispute over medical decisions rather than a criminal matter. They left after advising me to keep documentation of any further harassment. Monday morning, Francine filed a wrongful death lawsuit against me and Dr. Kapoor, claiming we'd conspired to end Melissa's life without proper medical justification and in violation of her wishes. The lawsuit sought $5 million in damages and demanded criminal investigation. Natasha called me furious and said this was completely frivolous given the court orders and medical evidence, but we'd have to respond formally. She filed a motion to dismiss based on the previous court proceedings and the established medical facts. The hospital's legal team filed their own motion to dismiss and requested sanctions against Malcolm for filing a baseless lawsuit designed purely to harass parties who'd acted appropriately under court supervision. I tried to plan Melissa's memorial service, but Francine filed an emergency motion claiming she had the right to control funeral arrangements as Melissa's mother. She demanded the service be delayed pending resolution of the wrongful death lawsuit and threatened to disrupt any service I planned. Natasha explained that, as Melissa's surviving spouse, I had legal authority over funeral arrangements, but Francine could try to cause problems at the actual service. I decided to have a small private funeral with just Sophie, my parents, and a few close friends who knew what we'd been going through. We held it at a quiet chapel on Thursday afternoon and said goodbye to Melissa properly, without the chaos Francine had created. I found out later that Francine held her own memorial service the same day, claiming I'd stolen her daughter's body and denied the family the chance to grieve properly. She invited everyone who'd been harassing me online and turned it into a rally against me, with people giving speeches about how I'd murdered Melissa for money and destroyed their family. Videos of the service were posted online with my name and face included, along with renewed calls for police investigation and prosecution. Someone sent the videos to my employer, and I had to meet with HR to explain the situation because clients had started asking questions after seeing the accusations online. My boss was understanding but said the negative publicity was concerning and suggested I take leave until things settled down. I couldn't afford to lose my job on top of everything else and assured him the lawsuit would be dismissed and the harassment would eventually stop. The wrongful death lawsuit motion hearing was scheduled for early April, and Natasha was confident it would be dismissed entirely given the extensive documentation supporting every decision I'd made. But she warned me that even if the lawsuit was dismissed, Francine might continue finding ways to cause problems. The harassment escalated when someone posted Sophie's school information online, suggesting people should ask her about how her father killed her mother. The school had to implement additional security measures, and I had to explain to the principal what was happening with Melissa's family. Sophie started having nightmares and refused to go to school because kids were asking her questions about her mother's death based on things their parents had seen online. I enrolled her in counseling with Dr. Vivian Cross, who specialized in childhood grief and trauma. Dr. Cross said Sophie was dealing with normal grief, complicated by the public nature of what had happened and the conflicting narratives she was hearing about her mother's death. I filed for a restraining order against Francine prohibiting her from contacting me or Sophie or posting about us online. The hearing was set for mid-April, and Natasha said we had strong grounds based on the pattern of harassment and the impact on Sophie. Meanwhile, the wrongful death lawsuit motion hearing happened, and Judge Kenneth Rothman dismissed the entire case with prejudice, calling it a baseless attempt to relitigate decisions that had already been reviewed and approved by another court. Judge Rothman issued a written opinion, noting that all medical decisions had been made appropriately, under proper legal authority, with extensive medical evidence supporting each action. He ordered Francine and Malcolm to pay our legal fees as sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit, and warned that any further legal actions without legitimate basis would result in additional penalties. Malcolm tried to argue that his client had a right to seek accountability, but Judge Rothman cut him off and said filing lawsuits based purely on emotional disagreement with court-approved medical decisions was an abuse of the legal system. Natasha sent me the opinion and said it was as strong a victory as we could have hoped for and should deter future legal harassment. But Francine wasn't deterred. She filed a custody petition claiming I was an unfit parent who'd traumatized Sophie by forcing her to watch her mother die, and that she as grandmother should have custody to protect Sophie from further harm. The petition cited the online harassment as evidence that Sophie was in an unsafe environment and claimed I'd failed to protect her from emotional damage. I was livid when Natasha called to tell me about the custody filing because Francine was the one who'd caused all the harassment and now was using it as justification to take my daughter. Natasha said we'd fight it vigorously, and it was unlikely any judge would remove Sophie from my custody given the circumstances, but we'd need to document everything, including Sophie's therapy progress and the stability of our home environment. The custody hearing was scheduled for late April, and a guardian ad litem named Philip Hutchins was appointed to investigate and make recommendations to the court. Philip came to our home and interviewed both Sophie and me extensively. He asked Sophie about her relationship with me and whether she felt safe and cared for. Sophie told him I was a good dad who'd explained everything about Mommy's death honestly and helped her understand what happened. She said she wanted to stay with me and didn't want to live with Grandma Francine because Francine scared her by saying mean things about Daddy. Philip interviewed my parents and Sophie's school counselor and Dr. Cross, all of whom provided statements supporting my parenting and describing the stable, supportive environment I'd maintained for Sophie despite the trauma of losing Melissa and dealing with Francine's harassment. Philip's report recommended dismissing Francine's custody petition entirely, noting that I had been an exemplary parent under extremely difficult circumstances, and Sophie was clearly bonded with me and thriving despite her grief. The custody hearing was surreal, with Francine's new attorney trying to paint me as negligent for allowing Sophie to be present when life support was withdrawn and for not protecting her from online harassment. Natasha systematically destroyed each argument by showing how I'd consulted with medical professionals about the appropriate way for Sophie to say goodbye to her mother, and how I'd immediately enrolled Sophie in counseling when the harassment began affecting her. Dr. Cross testified that including Sophie in Melissa's final moments had been therapeutically appropriate and would help her process the grief in a healthy way, that excluding her would have been more harmful in the long term. Philip testified about his investigation and his recommendation that Sophie remain in my full custody. Judge Barbara Tang read Philip's report carefully and then denied Francine's petition from the bench without requiring further testimony. She said it was clear that I was providing appropriate care for Sophie and that Francine's petition appeared to be motivated by anger at me rather than genuine concern for Sophie's welfare. Judge Tang also issued a new restraining order prohibiting Francine from having any contact with Sophie without my explicit permission and warning that further frivolous legal filings would result in sanctions. Francine broke down crying in the courtroom, and her attorney had to help her outside. I felt relieved, but also sad, because Melissa would have hated seeing her mother behave this way and would have been devastated by the rift that had developed. Sophie asked me that night if Grandma Francine would stop being mean now, and I told her the judge had made rules that Grandma had to follow. Sophie said she missed Grandma from before Mommy died when she was nice and baked cookies. I missed that version of Francine too, but that person seemed gone, replaced by someone consumed with grief and rage. 2 weeks after the custody hearing, someone broke into my house while Sophie and I were at my parents' for dinner. They didn't take anything valuable, but went through all our paperwork and files, clearly looking for something specific. I filed a police report and installed security cameras. Detective Omar Yassin came to investigate and asked if I had any idea who might have targeted me. I told him about everything with Francine, and he said he'd look into it, but without evidence it would be hard to prove. 3 days later, I got a call from Child Protective Services saying they'd received a report that Sophie was being neglected and living in unsanitary conditions, and a caseworker needed to conduct a home visit immediately. I was shocked because our house was clean and Sophie was well cared for, but I agreed to the visit. Caseworker Jennifer Soto came the next day and walked through our entire house, taking photos and asking detailed questions about Sophie's routines and care. She interviewed Sophie privately and checked that we had adequate food and that Sophie's medical and educational needs were being met. Jennifer seemed increasingly confused as the visit went on, and finally told me directly that the anonymous report had described a completely different situation than what she was observing. She said the report claimed Sophie was malnourished, sleeping on a dirty mattress, missing school frequently, and showing signs of physical abuse. None of that was true, and Jennifer documented thoroughly that the report was false. She asked who might have filed a malicious report, and I told her about Francine. Jennifer said she'd note that in her file and would recommend the case be closed immediately as unfounded. She also said filing false CPS reports was illegal, and I could pursue legal action if I could prove who made the report. Natasha filed a motion requesting phone records to identify who'd filed the false CPS report, arguing it was part of the ongoing harassment campaign. The motion was granted, and the records showed multiple calls to CPS from a phone number registered to Lorraine, Francine's sister. We filed criminal charges against Lorraine for filing a false report and requested an expanded restraining order covering Francine's entire family. Lorraine was arrested and charged with filing a false report to a government agency, a misdemeanor carrying potential jail time and fines. She immediately gave a statement saying Francine had asked her to make the call and had told her what to say in the report. The police then charged Francine with conspiracy and solicitation, upgrading the charges based on her role in orchestrating the false report. Francine's bail was set at $10,000, and she spent 2 days in jail before Gerald posted it. The criminal case proceeded through the system over the next few months, with both Francine and Lorraine eventually accepting plea deals. Lorraine got probation and community service for cooperating. Francine got 6 months in county jail and 3 years probation, plus mandatory counseling. The judge told her during sentencing that her grief over her daughter's death, while understandable, did not excuse the campaign of harassment and false accusations she'd directed at her son-in-law, who had made appropriate medical decisions under terrible circumstances. The judge said Francine's behavior had traumatized her granddaughter and violated numerous court orders, and she was fortunate to avoid prison time. Francine glared at me from the defendant's table, but didn't say anything. She was taken into custody immediately to begin serving her sentence. During those 6 months while Francine was in jail, my life gradually returned to something approaching normal. Sophie continued therapy and her grief symptoms slowly improved. She stopped having nightmares and started participating in activities at school again. The online harassment mostly stopped once Francine was incarcerated and couldn't continue coordinating attacks. I went back to work full-time, and my employer was supportive about the flexible schedule I needed to manage Sophie's care. I started attending a support group for widowers, which helped me process my own grief over losing Melissa and the trauma of everything that had happened afterward. The group leader, a therapist named Raymond Kemp, helped me understand that Francine's behavior had been a twisted form of grief that manifested as control and anger because she couldn't accept that her daughter was gone. That understanding didn't excuse what she'd done, but helped me make sense of it. When Francine was released from jail after serving 4 months with good behavior, her probation terms included staying at least 500 feet away from me and Sophie and completing a year of intensive counseling focused on grief processing and anger management. Her probation officer, Dana Flores, called me to make sure I understood the terms of Francine's release and to give me her direct number in case there were any violations. Dana said Francine had been difficult during her incarceration, refusing to participate in programs and maintaining that she'd done nothing wrong. The counseling was court-mandated, though, so Francine would have to comply or go back to jail. Over the next year, Francine stayed away from us completely, which was both a relief and sad, because Sophie did miss having a grandmother who wasn't hostile. I occasionally saw social media posts from Francine's friends showing she was alive and apparently functioning, but she never attempted any contact. Sophie asked about her sometimes, and I explained that Grandma was working on getting better but needed space to do that. 2 years after Melissa died, I started dating again after encouragement from Raymond and my support group. I met Lauren through mutual friends, and she was kind and understanding about my situation, including having a daughter who was still grieving her mother. Lauren never tried to replace Melissa in Sophie's life, but became a supportive presence who Sophie genuinely liked. After a year of dating, I proposed, and Lauren said yes. We planned a small wedding and didn't publicize it widely, specifically to avoid problems with Francine. But somehow Francine found out and filed a motion claiming our marriage would harm Sophie by forcing her to accept a replacement mother before she'd finished grieving. The motion was denied immediately, with Judge Tang noting that my personal life decisions were not subject to court approval and Francine had no legal standing to object. Francine didn't appear at the courthouse for the hearing, which was unusual. I got a call from Dana saying Francine had missed her scheduled probation check-in and they were trying to locate her. She warned me to be cautious and call police if Francine showed up anywhere near me. We went ahead with the wedding ceremony at my parents' house with just close family and friends. Sophie served as junior bridesmaid and seemed genuinely happy about Lauren joining our family. Everything went perfectly until we were cutting the cake and police knocked on the door asking to speak with me. Dana was with them, and she looked grim. She told me Francine had been found unconscious in her apartment from an apparent overdose of prescription medications. She'd left a note claiming her life had been destroyed and she had nothing left because I'd stolen her daughter and granddaughter. She was in the hospital in critical condition, and they didn't know if she'd survive. I felt a complicated mix of guilt and anger and sadness hearing about Francine's suicide attempt. Despite everything she'd done, I'd never wanted her to hurt herself, and Melissa would have been devastated by all of this. I told Dana to keep me updated, but I didn't go to the hospital because of the restraining order and because I didn't think my presence would help anything. Francine survived and was transferred to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. The evaluation determined she had complicated grief disorder and elements of delusional thinking regarding Melissa's death and my role in it. She was held for mandatory psychiatric treatment for 90 days, and her probation was modified to include intensive mental health supervision. When she was released, Gerald called me for the first time in 2 years and asked if we could talk. We met at a coffee shop, and he apologized for everything that had happened, saying he'd enabled Francine's behavior because he'd been grieving too and hadn't wanted to believe his mother was acting inappropriately. He said the suicide attempt had forced him to accept that Francine needed serious help, and he was committed to making sure she got it. Gerald asked if there was any path forward where Francine might eventually have supervised contact with Sophie because despite everything she did, love her granddaughter, and Sophie might benefit from having that relationship in some form. I told him I'd think about it and discuss it with Sophie's therapist. Dr. Abik Cross said supervised visits could potentially be therapeutic if Francine demonstrated genuine progress in treatment and accepted responsibility for her actions. She recommended starting with supervised video calls to test whether Francine could interact with Sophie appropriately without directing anger at me or rehashing past conflicts. 6 months later, after Francine had completed intensive outpatient treatment, and her therapist provided documentation of significant progress, we arranged the first video call with Sophie. Dr. Cross sat with Sophie during the call and monitored the interaction. Francine cried when she saw Sophie and apologized for not being present in her life and said she'd been very sick but was getting better. Sophie was cautious, but talked about school and her activities and seemed pleased that Francine was interested. The call lasted 20 minutes and went reasonably well with no inappropriate comments. We did monthly calls for several months, and Francine gradually seemed more stable, focusing on Sophie rather than on her anger at me. Eventually, we progressed to supervised in-person visits at a family therapy center with Dr. Cross present. Francine brought small gifts and asked appropriate questions about Sophie's life and was careful not to say anything negative about me or Lauren. Sophie responded positively and started looking forward to the visits. After a year of successful supervised contact, Dr. Cross recommended allowing unsupervised visits with specific boundaries, including no discussion of Melissa's death or the legal battles. Francine agreed to all terms, and the visits continued without major problems. She'd never be the grandmother she was before Melissa died, but she'd become someone who could have a limited, appropriate relationship with Sophie. 3 years after Melissa's death, I attended my first support group meeting since getting remarried and shared my story about the disturbing lengths Francine had gone to control decisions that weren't hers to make. The group leader asked how I'd survived the ordeal, and I said, through documentation, good lawyers, therapeutic support, and the knowledge that every decision I'd made had been right, even when it was hard. I'd honored Melissa's wishes, protected Sophie, and eventually even helped Francine get the mental health treatment she needed. The court system had worked despite the harassment, and justice had prevailed through combination of legal protections and medical ethics standards that couldn't be manipulated by grief-driven control attempts. Sophie was thriving with Lauren as her stepmother, while maintaining appropriate connection with Francine. I'd rebuilt my life without betraying Melissa's memory, proving that doing the right thing under terrible circumstances could eventually lead to healing even when others tried desperately to prevent it. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.